A German Shepherd puppy, locked in total darkness since he was just 1 month old. No sounds, no light, no love. Everyone thought he'd never be normal. But when the door finally opened and light hit his eyes, what he did shocked everyone. This isn't just a rescue. It's a journey of trust, healing, and a bond that will move you to tears. The small wooden door hadn't been opened in over 2 weeks. Behind it, hidden from the world, a German Shepherd puppy lay curled in the farthest corner of a musty shed. He was barely 2 months old, but his body had already learned to fear every noise and every vibration that passed through the walls. The space he lived in wasn't meant for animals, or for anyone. Just 4 cracked concrete walls, a dripping pipe, and an old towel stained with mildew. That towel was the only thing he had. No toys, no voices, no fresh air, and especially no light. He didn't even have a name. His ears perked up every time he heard footsteps pass by. Most of the time, they didn't stop, but when they did, it meant a metal bowl of dry food being shoved under the door and sliding across the floor, sometimes spilling, sometimes not. The humans who owned the place weren't cruel by intent, just careless. They had bred a litter they couldn't afford to keep and placed the weakest pup in the back shed, just until someone wants him. But no one ever came, and so he stayed. Every day in the darkness, the puppy's heart beat a little faster with each unfamiliar sound. His muscles tensed, his eyes saw nothing but blackness. His instincts, those sharp, natural instincts that German Shepherds are born with, started to turn inward. He wasn't learning to play. He was learning to survive. Then, one morning, the sound changed. It was earlier than usual, softer, slower. A different pair of boots approached the shed. Boots that didn't stomp but stepped. There was a pause. Then the sound of metal scraping. The door creaked. For the first time in a month, the tiniest sliver of daylight cut across the floor like a blade of fire. The puppy didn't move. He trembled, pressing himself tighter into the corner. His pupils shrank violently as the light flooded in. He blinked fast, confused, afraid, and then he growled. It was a weak growl, uncertain, but it was the only defense he knew. Standing in the doorway was a man with a calm face and sun-worn hands. His name was Daniel, a 42-year-old animal control officer who had responded to an anonymous tip. He hadn't expected to find this. Not a German Shepherd puppy alone in the dark, bones showing, legs shaking. Daniel dropped to a knee, careful not to come too close. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. "It's okay. I see you." The puppy didn't move. His eyes darted in every direction, trying to find a shadow to hide in. But there was none. Only light. Warm, blinding light. Daniel extended his hand slowly, palm up, letting it hover just above the floor. He didn't speak again. He just waited. Minutes passed like hours. And then something shifted. The puppy took one step forward. It was shaky, hesitant, but it was a step. Then another. His nose twitched as he caught a scent that didn't feel like fear. For the first time in his life, someone was looking at him, not through him. He reached Daniel's hand and stopped. Then gently, almost accidentally, he nudged it with his nose. Daniel didn't move. Tears welled in his eyes. "You've been so brave," he whispered. "You didn't give up." Outside the shed, the sun rose higher, casting a golden light over Daniel's shoulder. The puppy blinked again, adjusting, slowly walking toward the warmth, toward the first human who didn't turn away. And then, with one sudden motion, the puppy did something unexpected. He sat, right next to Daniel, as if he'd made his choice. Daniel stayed crouched, barely breathing. The young German Shepherd was right beside him now, close enough to touch, but still wrapped in uncertainty. Every muscle in the pup's little body remained tense, like a coiled spring ready to snap. But he didn't run. He didn't growl. He just waited. Daniel knew the next move was critical. He slowly turned his hand over and, with the gentlest movement, let his fingers graze the puppy's fur. It was coarse, dirty, and matted in places, but warm, alive. The puppy flinched at first, then froze. "Good boy," Daniel said softly, his voice barely louder than a breath. It was the first human touch the pup had felt in over a month. And strangely, it didn't hurt. It didn't scare him. It calmed him. Daniel reached into his side pouch and pulled out a small, soft piece of chicken. He laid it on the ground between them and backed away slowly, giving the pup space. The scent hit the shepherd's nose instantly. He hesitated, then sniffed, and finally took a careful bite. It was gone in seconds. That small moment of trust was all Daniel needed. He left the shed door wide open and walked to his truck, returning moments later with a blanket, a soft collar, and a small crate lined with fresh towels. Not a cage. He hated cages, but something safe, familiar, warm. When he re-entered the shed, the puppy was still sitting in the same spot, blinking at the light, blinking at him. "Let's go home," Daniel whispered. It took over an hour, coaxing the dog inch by inch toward the crate. He didn't force it. He just waited, letting the puppy decide. Every few minutes, Daniel placed another piece of chicken closer to the opening, and when the pup finally stepped in and curled up without command, Daniel closed the crate door gently, without a sound. The ride back to Daniel's small farmhouse was quiet. No barking, no whimpering, just two lives sitting in silence, one learning to trust, the other learning to hope. Daniel lived alone on a few acres of land outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. His home was old but sturdy, with wide fields, a wooden porch, and a dog bed already waiting by the fireplace. He'd prepared for this, though he hadn't expected the emotional weight that came with rescuing a soul so fragile. He placed the crate in the living room and opened the door. The puppy didn't come out, not at first. He just looked around. Slowly, cautiously, he inched out, one paw at a time, and when he stepped onto the soft rug, he flinched, not because of pain, but because it felt good. He looked up at Daniel, and Daniel sat cross-legged on the floor, holding the same chicken in his palm. Again, the puppy came closer. Again, he took the food. And then, just like in the shed, he sat down beside him. That night, Daniel didn't name him. Not yet. He believed names were earned, not given in haste. He simply referred to him as Buddy. At 2 a.m., Daniel woke up to a small weight pressing against the side of his bed. The puppy had wandered out of the living room and curled up next to the spot where Daniel's arm hung over the edge. No barking, no scratching, just quiet breathing. For the first time in his short life, the German Shepherd puppy wasn't alone in the dark. But trust is fragile, and healing doesn't come overnight. Because in the days ahead, something would trigger a fear so deep, Daniel would realize that saving a dog's body is one thing, but rescuing his soul is another. The first few days were quiet. Daniel kept things simple. No sudden movements, no loud noises. He let the puppy explore the house at his own pace. Every door stayed open. No crates, no confinement. The house, for the first time in the dog's life, was his to move through freely. Still, he rarely wandered more than a few feet away from Daniel. He followed silently, his steps light and unsure. But he followed. Daniel noticed that the pup flinched whenever a door closed too fast or a shadow moved across the wall. Once, when a neighbor dropped off mail and knocked a bit too hard on the front door, the puppy bolted under the kitchen table, trembling and growling softly, eyes wide in pure fear. Daniel crouched low, holding his hand out. "I'm here, buddy. It's okay. You're safe now." Eventually, the trembling stopped, but the fear lingered in the puppy's eyes. On the fourth day, something unexpected happened. It was supposed to be a calm morning. Daniel had planned to take the puppy outside to the back pasture for the first time. The sun was out, the fields golden, and the air crisp. He gently fastened the soft collar around the pup's neck. There was hesitation, of course, but the dog didn't resist. He even sat as Daniel attached a long leash. "You're doing great," Daniel whispered with a proud smile. As they stepped outside, the puppy paused on the threshold. His eyes squinted at the bright light. The smells, the breeze, the birds overhead. It was overwhelming. But he didn't turn back. Step by shaky step, he followed Daniel into the field. That first walk was slow, gentle. Daniel gave him space to sniff, to sit, to just exist. And then, it happened. From a nearby road, the sudden roar of a motorcycle ripped through the air. Loud, sharp, aggressive. In an instant, Everything in the puppy's body reverted. He dropped low to the ground, tail tucked tight between his legs, ears flat, eyes wild. He yanked against the leash so hard Daniel nearly lost his grip. The panic was total, an eruption of terror that sent the puppy spinning, clawing at the leash, trying to escape. Hey, buddy, I've got you. It's okay, it's okay. Daniel's voice was firm but calm, trying to anchor him. But the puppy was gone, mentally. Back in that shed, back in the dark, back in the place where loud sounds meant fear, and nobody came to help. Daniel let go of the leash, not to abandon him, but to give him space. He knew restraint would only escalate the panic. The shepherd bolted back toward the house, scratching at the door with desperation. Daniel caught up quickly and opened it. The puppy ran straight to the farthest corner under the dining table and curled up, shaking uncontrollably. Daniel sat nearby. He didn't try to touch him. He just sat. For minutes. Maybe an hour. Finally, the shaking slowed. Later that day, Daniel sat on the porch with a notebook in hand. He wasn't just a rescuer. He was a learner. He wanted to understand trauma, dog behavior, healing. He needs more than love, he muttered to himself. He needs time, a plan, safety. That night, Daniel brought the dog's bed into his room, not to force closeness, but to remind him, "You're not alone." He laid out a piece of the same chicken beside it. When he turned off the lights, he listened. At first, there was only silence, but then, soft pause. The puppy walked into the room and gently curled into the bed. He didn't sleep well. He twitched in his dreams, whimpering softly as memories clawed their way to the surface. Daniel knelt beside him and rested a hand near the edge of the bed. "I'm here," he whispered again. "Every night, every storm, I'm here." But storms don't only come from the sky, because just when Daniel thought he was making progress, an unexpected visitor would knock on the door, bringing with them a truth about the puppy's past that would change everything. It was a Thursday afternoon, 5 days after the puppy's rescue. Daniel had just returned from picking up supplies, soft toys, special shampoo for sensitive skin, and calming treats. He was committed, all in. The puppy, who still had no name, was beginning to eat without fear and had even started wagging his tail. Just once or twice, but it was something. Daniel had been working on building a routine. He wanted to give the dog what he'd never had before: predictability, peace, and presence. The house smelled like chicken broth and freshly cut grass. For once, everything felt calm. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the door. The sound sent the puppy, who had been resting by the fireplace, into instant alert. His head shot up. His body froze. Then, without a sound, he bolted to the corner near the couch and ducked behind it. Daniel sighed and walked slowly to the door. Standing outside was a young woman, maybe mid-20s, with a clipboard in her hand and a nervous look on her face. She wore jeans, a loose sweatshirt, and a badge around her neck that read, "Animal Welfare Services, Shelby County." Daniel opened the screen door. "Can I help you?" "Hi," she said, her voice uncertain. "Are you Daniel Carter?" He nodded. She looked down at her clipboard. "We received a follow-up request. You reported a neglected dog last week. A German Shepherd puppy?" "Yes, he's inside," Daniel replied cautiously. "Is something wrong?" The woman shifted on her feet. "Not wrong, exactly, but we traced the property, the people who owned him. Well, there's a history there. I just came to confirm some things." Daniel opened the door wider. "Come in." She stepped inside and immediately noticed the dog peeking out from behind the couch. Her entire demeanor softened. "Oh, poor guy." Daniel crossed his arms. "He's made progress, but it's fragile." The woman knelt gently but didn't approach. "Do you know his background?" Daniel shook his head. "Only what I saw. A shed. No light. Skin and bones." She hesitated, then pulled a file from her bag and opened it on the kitchen counter. Inside were photos, some of the shed, some of other dogs. "He wasn't the only one," she said. "The family was breeding for cash. The mother was sold early. 3 of the pups died within the first month. He was the only one left." Daniel clenched his jaw. She flipped to another page. He was listed in our system. Briefly, someone had taken him in for a week before returning him. Daniel blinked. Wait, what? He was taken to a foster house for a week, but apparently he bit someone. The woman looked genuinely heartbroken. They returned him the next day. The shelter was over capacity. He got placed back with the breeder while the case was being processed. That's how he ended up in that shed again. Daniel walked to the fireplace and looked down at the dog. His ears were low, body still, watching every movement. The idea that someone had taken him in, only to give up the moment he acted out, hit Daniel like a punch to the chest. He's not aggressive, Daniel said firmly. He's scared. I know, she said. He's lucky to have you, but I had to warn you. There's a chance the previous owners might try to reclaim him. Legally, the case is still under review. Daniel turned slowly. His voice was low but steady. They're not getting him back. She nodded. I didn't think you'd let that happen. That night, Daniel sat outside under the stars. The dog came and lay beside his feet, eyes darting between the trees, still nervous but learning. You've been let down more than once, Daniel whispered. But not anymore. He reached down and stroked the pup's back. And this time, the dog leaned into it. That was the first moment Daniel said it out loud. Your name is Shadow. The dog looked up, ears perked. Because you've been in the dark, Daniel continued. But now, you're walking toward the light. But just as their bond begins to deepen, the people who failed Shadow the first time will return. And this time, they'll come knocking with paperwork in hand. It was just past 10 a.m. when Daniel saw the car pull up. A dusty blue sedan with out-of-state plates. The tires crunched across the gravel driveway. Daniel froze on the porch, coffee in hand, as the car door opened and a man stepped out. Mid-40s, sunburned skin, flannel shirt, boots still caked with dried mud. A woman followed behind him. Younger, dark hair, arms crossed tightly, her jaw locked in a scowl. Daniel recognized neither of them, but Shadow did. From inside the house, a low, guttural growl echoed through the screen door. The shepherd's ears flattened. His stance dropped. He backed away from the window, eyes locked on the strangers as if ghosts from a nightmare had returned. Daniel stepped forward, blocking their view. You lost? He asked coldly. The man shook his head. We're here for the dog. Daniel stiffened. You're who? I'm Rick Snyder, the man said, pulling a folded document from his back pocket. That dog, Shadow, or whatever you're calling him, he's mine. No, Daniel said flatly. He's not. Rick's voice turned defensive. I've got paperwork, from the shelter, from the breeder. The woman beside him spoke up for the first time. You don't get to keep something that doesn't belong to you. Daniel's hands curled into fists, but his voice remained calm. He's not a thing. He's a living being, one you neglected and locked in a shed for a month. Rick shrugged. I didn't abuse him. We were figuring things out. Breeding's not easy. You left a puppy in total darkness, alone, without human contact. That's not breeding. That's abandonment. Rick took a step forward. Look, we can do this the easy way or the legal way, but that dog is ours. We've got a lawyer ready if you want to fight. From inside the house, Shadow barked, loud, fierce, but underneath the noise, Daniel heard something else. Panic. After the confrontation, Daniel called the only person he trusted from the system, Officer Kelly, the young woman from Animal Welfare. She arrived by the afternoon, documents in hand. They filed a claim, she said grimly. They're requesting temporary custody while the ownership case is reviewed. Daniel paced the living room. They don't care about him. They just want control. Kelly nodded. I know, but they have legal ground to stand on, at least for now, unless we can prove imminent danger if he returns to them. Daniel glanced at Shadow, who was lying on the rug, ears still twitching from every sound. What if I file for emergency foster guardianship? Daniel asked. Can I petition for temporary custody until the case is closed? Kelly thought for a moment. It's possible, but you'll need statements, proof of mistreatment, photos, a vet's evaluation, and character references. Then I'll get them all, Daniel said, voice low but determined. Whatever it takes. The next few days were a blur of movement. Daniel took Shadow to a vet specializing in trauma cases. The diagnosis was clear: extreme anxiety, underdevelopment from lack of socialization, malnutrition, and signs of emotional neglect. Daniel contacted his neighbors, who agreed to write statements about Shadow's condition when he arrived. Kelly helped file the petition, and through it all, Shadow stayed close, closer than ever before. He followed Daniel from room to room. He began sleeping not just in the same room, but pressed gently against the side of the bed. He even began playing, awkwardly, clumsily, with a soft, squeaky toy Daniel had placed near the fireplace. But they both knew the clock was ticking. The hearing would be in 1 week, and if the court sided with the Snyders, Shadow could be taken away. On the 6th night, Daniel sat by the fire, eyes fixed on the sleeping dog at his feet. "You changed my life, buddy," he whispered, "but I'm not done fighting for yours." He reached down and gently stroked Shadow's ear. The dog stirred, looked up, and licked Daniel's hand. For the first time, it wasn't a reaction born of fear or food. It was trust. But trust alone won't win a courtroom. Because when Daniel walks into that hearing next week, he'll be forced to relive every moment of Shadow's pain and prove that love means more than a piece of paper. The courtroom was quiet, not the kind of silence that comforts, but the kind that holds its breath, the kind that waits to see if justice will finally speak. Daniel sat in the front row, fingers locked together tightly in his lap. His boots were dusty from the barn that morning. He hadn't slept well. Shadow was back at home, being watched by a trusted neighbor. Daniel had wanted to bring him, but Kelly advised against it. Too many people, too much noise, too much risk. The judge entered. Middle-aged, firm expression, tired eyes. She glanced over the file in front of her, then looked at both sides of the room. On one bench, Daniel, alone, with Kelly 2 seats behind him. On the other, Rick and his wife, dressed up, calm, rehearsed. The hearing began. Rick went first. His attorney spoke smoothly, confidently, handing the judge printed records of ownership, shelter intake notes, and the original breeder's documentation. He framed Rick as a misunderstood dog lover who had made an unfortunate but non-malicious mistake. He never intended to harm the animal, the attorney said. He simply didn't have the resources at the time. Once he was contacted, he immediately moved to reclaim the dog, showing he's willing to make things right. Daniel's jaw clenched. He listened to every word, every carefully chosen phrase, every lie wrapped in legal language. Then it was his turn. Daniel stood, walked to the center of the room with a folder in his hand. Nothing fancy, just papers carefully collected over the last week. He didn't speak like a lawyer. He spoke like a man who had something to lose. "I'm not here to make this about me," he began. "I'm here to speak for a dog who can't speak for himself." He handed the judge photos, taken the day Shadow was rescued. The shed, the filth, the dark, the ribs showing through his thin fur. He handed over the vet's evaluation, citing emotional trauma and delayed development due to prolonged isolation. He wasn't just neglected, Daniel said. He was forgotten. For over a month, no stimulation, no care, no human contact. The judge flipped through the documents silently. "I didn't rescue Shadow because it was convenient," Daniel continued. "I did it because no one else did. Because when I saw him in that corner, shaking from the light, I knew he'd already been failed once." He paused. "And now, we have a choice. We can send him back into uncertainty, or we can protect what he's finally found." He stepped back. No drama, just truth. The judge took a deep breath and looked at both sides. "The law recognizes ownership," she said, "but it also recognizes the best interest of a living being." She reviewed the evidence again, then turned to Rick. "You had your chance. You didn't just fail this animal. You abandoned him in the most formative weeks of his life." Her gavel came down. "Temporary custody remains with Mr. Carter. A permanent adoption review will be scheduled in 60 days. Until then, all contact with the animal is prohibited by the former owners." Daniel exhaled for the first time in minutes. It wasn't over yet. Not officially. but it was enough. For now. Shadow was safe. That night, Daniel pulled into the driveway just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The screen door creaked open, and the neighbor smiled. He's been waiting by the window all day. Daniel walked into the house and dropped to one knee. Shadow barreled into him, not nervously, not cautiously, but like a dog who finally understood that home was real. Daniel wrapped his arms around him and whispered, "We did it, buddy." Shadow didn't flinch. He just stayed. But one more chapter remains, because before this journey can truly end, there's one final thing Daniel must do. Give Shadow the life he never had, and the forever home he's always deserved. 60 days. That's how long it took for everything to become official. 60 days of paperwork, check-ins, home visits, and final signatures. But Daniel didn't mind. Every sunrise was a gift. Every moment was a reminder of how far Shadow had come. By now, Shadow had a routine. He woke up early, padded into the kitchen, and waited quietly as Daniel brewed his morning coffee. They walked the fields together before breakfast, Shadow always trotting ahead, pausing every few feet to check if Daniel was still close behind. He no longer flinched at slamming doors. He no longer hid from the sun. And most of all, he wagged his tail now, freely, often. There were milestones Daniel didn't expect to mean so much. The first time Shadow barked playfully at a squirrel, the first time he laid on his back, paws in the air, asking for belly rubs. The first time he stood guard at the front gate, not out of fear, but loyalty. And one night, as a thunderstorm rolled over the valley, Shadow stayed on the porch beside Daniel. No trembling, no panic, just a steady presence. He had learned the light wasn't going to turn off again. The final adoption hearing was short. A judge smiled and handed Daniel the official document. Shadow Carter, legally, permanently, was his. No more courtrooms. No more threats. Just a man and his dog. Family. On the way home, Daniel stopped at the local pet store. He picked up a new collar. Leather, strong, engraved with a single word. Shadow. And beneath it, "You are safe now." That night, Daniel placed the new collar around Shadow's neck and knelt to his level. "You're not in the dark anymore," he whispered. "And I promise, you never will be again." Shadow leaned in, gently resting his head on Daniel's shoulder. No fear, no flinch, just trust. Some dogs are born into love. Others have to survive long enough to find it. Shadow didn't just find a home. He found a second chance, a voice that spoke for him, and a man who refused to let his light be stolen. If this story inspired you, remember, there are thousands of dogs like Shadow still waiting for someone to choose them. Courage and compassion can change a life. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this story with someone who believes in second chances. Let's keep spreading hope, one rescue at a time.